you ready? We'll make a start. Hello. Hi, can we have a bit of quiet, please, and we'll try and make a start because the time's pretty much time to start. Okay. Good morning. My name's Andrew Blackman, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for this seminar that's been arranged by this. You're right. Sorry. It was supposed to be muted already. I don't know. Can you try and do it? Hello? Right, we'll try again. Sorry about that, false start. My name's Andrew Blackman, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for this seminar that's been arranged by the Survey and Spatial New Zealand Cadastral Stream. Also, a big welcome to the large number of members who are watching the live stream around the country. So, firstly, some housekeeping matters. So, in the case of an emergency, obviously there are exits to the room at the front and the side. Depending on the type of emergency, if it's a fire, then we need to exit the building. If it's an earthquake, then we need to stay put. So if we're exiting, there's exit. Once you go out of the room, there's exits down that end of the corridor and over out there. So, and depending on the type of emergency, there'll be an announcement if the siren goes off. In terms of toilets, there's toilets just down the corridor on that side. And morning tea and that sort of thing would just be outside the doors here. So, and also one more thing, if you can make sure your cell phones are on silent, please. So late last year, when I first heard that Land Information New Zealand's decision to require the lodgement of field notes again, I thought we'll be going back to the way it was in the 1970s. However, the more I thought about it and discussed the change with others, the more I thought about the advances in technology since then. Looking around the room, there are probably a few who'd started their careers back in the 1970s, but there'll be plenty that hadn't. So let's take a moment to think about cadastral surveys back then. Typically, surveyors would have had a glass circle theodolite, maybe a wild T1 or a T1A, and a steel band. Typographical surveys would have likely been carried out by Stadia, and everything would have been recorded, reduced, and plotted by hand. There were no mobile phones, no computers, and even the first pocket-sized scientific calculator, the HP 35, was only introduced in 1972. So prior to this, calculations were most likely done with reference to six-figure log tables, or on a calculating machine such as a Munro in the office. There was no GNSS, and EDM was still in its infancy and generally not in use for cadastral surveys. There was no electronic recording, and all measurements were therefore read by eye and recorded by hand in a field book. So that these measurements could be later interpreted correctly, surveyors had standard methods for booking field measurements, which clearly showed what had been done. As technology developed and electronic recording became more common, in a way the surveyor has been bypassed, with measurements being recorded by the instrumentation and downloaded directly to a computer for processing. This advance was great for efficiency and removed human reading error, but a field record changed from being an essential part of the process to being an optional report that could be produced if required. So much has changed, and today we'll consider what is now possible. For this, we have two surveyors from leading equipment suppliers. They're Bruce Robinson from Global Survey and Mel Harrington, who's with Trimble. They operate at the leading edge of technology, and they will discuss style sheets and other ways of creating a clear and meaningful record for your electronic measurements. After that, we'll have a half-hour morning tea break. Watching the screen for long periods is a bit tough, so if you're watching online, you'll also be able to have a break and stretch your legs. After morning tea, we'll hear from two more surveyors with recent experience in private practice. One is Erin Cameron, the Director of Surveying at Envelope in Wellington. Erin's recently established the surveying department at her company, and therefore she has practical experience of developing from scratch the systems and processes that we'll be discussing today. The other is Tony Nichol, who's now at Land Information New Zealand here in Christchurch. However, before this, Tony had many years running his own business in Motueka. Tony will likely be familiar to many of you from a number of other seminars, and he has a strong interest in this topic. We'll conclude with a panel discussion where we'll put questions to our four presenters. We have a number of pre-prepared questions, and there will be opportunity for questions from the floor and also from those watching the live stream through the Slido app. But before any of this, we'll begin with Tony Nichol, who will provide a useful perspective from Land Information New Zealand, including some background to the new rules and what LINZ is looking for. So, an introduction to Tony. Tony's a licensed cadastral surveyor with over 44 years of cadastral surveying experience, with 25 of these being in private practice in the Motueka, Tasman region. Tony's recently changed focus and is now working for Land Information New Zealand as a licensed cadastral surveyor. Tony served on both the Cadastral Surveys Licensing Board and the Council of Survey and Spatial New Zealand, and he's a fellow of the Institute. Tony's also been a recipient of a number of Institute awards for demonstrating quality, excellence, and innovation in the fields of GNSS, cadastral, and spatial surveying. So please join with me now and give Tony a very warm welcome.
We're live now? Great. And welcome also to all our electronic visitors via the webcast. It's good to be able to speak to you all. So field information and accurate water boundary record, these are two aspects of the new rule that touch on field information and what we'll need to be doing about that. So we'll have a quick look at the background, the reasons for the change, what the new rules are, the guidance that LINZ has provided around these rules. We've been asked to answer the question, what does LINZ want? I've rephrased this as what is acceptable. There's a difference between want, need, and what's truly essential. And if we get a chance at the end, we'll talk a little bit about accurate water boundary, because I'm sure that's something you may not have heard before. It's a new definition in the rules. So the background to the changes, well, as mentioned, we've come a long way since the 1870s, well over a century and a half of cadastral surveying in New Zealand. And interestingly, looking back, the regulations in 1877, the regulations for the survey of native lands, this really prescribed, or was the first effort to prescribe, the requirement to record field information. And it's really continued down to this day in one form or another. Now you'll notice there that not only was field information to be recorded, but it was also required to be accurately reduced so that it could be used in the plans and later on cadastral survey data sets that were presented for approval for titles to issue. Later on, the 1959 regulations, I found these really interesting to have a glance at. We won't spend too much time on them. But at the level of prescription in the 1959 regulations was quite detailed. And if you think about it today, it's a really good template for us to think back to what those regulations said. And I'd say that if you're looking for a field office procedure or something that defines what your field crew should do in the field, just look back to these 59 regulations. Notice the requirement for clarity. The information needed to be clearly recorded. And it needed to be done in such a way that someone else could reproduce the work the surveyor had done. The original notes were not to be erased. So in other words, that record was important. If there was a mistake, you put a line through it. You didn't rub it out. If you rubbed it out, you ran the risk of rubbing something else out that was truly important. And just a little bit more there, it said the surveyor shall ensure that all distances shown in the field complied with the standards. So again, that requirement for an accurate reduction to the datum the survey was on. And field notes should be accompanied with the plan. So the requirement even in 1877 and 1959 was that the field notes were an essential part of the lodgement of the data set with the governing authority at the time to ensure that the representation was accurate and correct. It gave a chance for those plan examiners to confirm information that may have been having a discrepancy in it. They could check that. The regulations in 1972 were pretty much the same. They required that field notes be recorded and accompanied with a plan, and completed field books were to be retained. They were to be kept as an official record. And that was right from 1877 right up until 72. Interestingly, there was an amendment made in 1977 to the 72 regulations that now made it optional to submit field notes with a data set. You could just submit the survey sheet. The field notes were not required, but in the background, they were still to be retained by the surveyor who had his field book issued to him. That was clarified in the 1988 and the 2002 rules. There was still this requirement for the record of observations to be retained and to be made available on request. And in 2010, this was duplicated. The only difference in 2010 was that the limitation on the retention was reduced to 7 years. So they didn't have to retain them forever. Hopefully you returned your field book when it was full anyway. But if you didn't submit field information with your data set, you at least had to keep it on file for 7 years. Now, what's interesting about that is often when we're looking at surveys and LINs, we're trying to figure out what a conflict is. Was there a wrong measurement made? Some of those data sets go back 50, 100 years. So 7 years wasn't really a realistic time frame. So the new rules, well, are they really the old rules reworded? So we can see here our survey field, which is Sir Arthur Tyndale and his companion, roughly in the 1920s. It's got some really high-tech, groundbreaking equipment there for the day. In fact, I've used all those pieces of equipment on cadastral surveys in my career. You might get a hint about the staff later on. But what do you think is the most important piece of kit on that slide? You got the groundbreaking continuous steel band there that got rid of the Gunter's chain. I think he's even got a cloth tape for little short distances. Well, here's my take on the most important piece of field equipment. Without the field note, without recording what you've measured, what's the point? Go back to the office, you've got nothing to use. So field notes are very critical to the completion of a data set once someone has returned to the office. So here are the new rules, Cadastral Survey rules, Rule 71E. All relevant field information must be presented in a form that ensures permanent usability. So the keywords there are relevant, form, and usability. How are you going to structure those field notes so that yourself and others can interpret that information? And alongside that, Rule 71F, when you have a new water boundary as part of your survey data set, that needs to include an accurate record of the position of any new water boundary. Now, there's a difference between field information or a field note and a water boundary record, which we'll demonstrate a little bit later. So the key changes then? Well, the change is that we've gone back to the way we used to before 2010. Field information needs to be submitted with the data set for approval. And 71F, which is a new requirement, if your field notes don't give enough information to accurately produce the water boundary, there needs to be a separate record of the water boundary position that's accurate enough for others to reproduce it. The reason why? Land Online can distort water boundaries that are submitted as part of your data set. As many of you will know, when I've sent you an email to say, hey, look, we've got a distortion in your water boundary, can we fix it up? Well, this requirement of the accurate water boundary fix will enable others to be able to determine where that water boundary was. You can't just download the line work that's in Land Online, hope it's in the right place. So why the change? Well, what we've found, and the Surveyor General has commented on this, when there's a request for field information that we don't have on record at the moment, there's considerable delays. The surveyor has to dig it out, they have to send it to us, and then either we're using it or we're passing it on to a surveyor that's requested that information. Now, often that can take a lot of time, and in some cases that information might have gone missing. We're trying to avoid gaps, and there's a concern over missing data. Just in the last year, I think I've had 2 requests for field information that was less than 7 years old, and the surveyor said, oh, can't find it, it's gone. So that missing critical information has disappeared because it wasn't retained correctly. Submitting it with the data set avoids that problem. And it avoids unnecessary work. Imagine if you get a phone call from me tomorrow, I want to see this data set, the field notes for this data set that you did 6.5 years ago. Oh, crumbs, I've archived that, now where is it? And there's this frantic flurry in trying to find it and put it in a presentable form that you can email it back. So that actually avoids catching the surveyor on the hop, and it avoids creating extra work for you that might take you longer to do as time has passed by than to do it right there on the spot when you're submitting the data set. And also, there was quite a strong response to the feedback to the review of the new rules, and the Surveyor General and his team received several responses about the disappointment that the requirement for field notes to be retained by LINs for future use had gone in the 2010 rules. So perhaps a little indication there that the 2010 rules might not have got it quite right with that 7-year limit. So just looking at this montage of images crossing the screen right now, put yourself in this situation, you come across these pieces of important critical definition evidence in your fieldwork. Ask yourself the question, what would you record? Why would you record it? And how? All important information that we gather on a day-to-day basis, and the whole basis of our cadastre in New Zealand is evidential based. It's not mathematically based. Mathematics is the thing right at the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence. Guess what? Monuments in the ground, field evidence that you've measured right there on the spot, is right at the top of the hierarchy of evidence. And just to reinforce this, we don't have a definition of good survey practice in New Zealand anymore, but we do have a definition of bad survey practice. It's in Schedule 2 of the Cadastral Survey Act 2002, and I've had quite a bit of experience with this schedule over my 9 years with the licensing board. So just a couple of key factors that come out of those. You're deemed to have, or if the case is proven correct, an alleged professional misconduct complaint against you. You could have done professional misconduct if you, without having carried out sufficient checks to ensure the accuracy of the entries in any field book. That hasn't changed. Probably field book's a bit old-fashioned. Field information is the key word now. But if you've recorded something incorrectly and haven't checked that, submitted your data set, you sign your data set saying it's correct, it's accurate and correct. You could be up for a discussion with the licensing board. It doesn't specifically mention field notes in Schedule 2D there, but it says if in the operation of pegging and ground marking, you have not been carried out in accordance with the standards set under Part 5. Now that's Part 5 is the Surveyor General's guidelines, the Surveyor General's rules, and under that would be this expression in the conduct of a survey. So how can you prove to me that you've placed that ground mark in the correct position? That's a key important factor. And I think this is where independent peg tie checks come in. And that's probably the most important part of any field note if you're wanting to avoid civil litigation claims for getting things wrong, or a professional misconduct claim by purporting to have pegged someone's boundary over here, when in fact it was supposed to be over there. And finally, and this is probably where fraud comes in, and believe it or not, there has been a professional misconduct complaint, at least one, if not more, on this topic, to have made any entry in any field book or other record that purports to have been derived from observation or measurement in the field, if it has not been so derived. So really the writing's on the wall there. Don't be fraudulent. Record what you measure in the field, black and white. Don't fudge it. Now you might find a peg, and like in one of those early images, it's on a lean, and you've dug down, you've actually found the base of it. Well, why not record where you find the top of it, because you're not sure whether the top's right or the bottom's right, and record where the bottom of it is. Record both. When you're back in the office, you can determine which is the correct one and make a notation accordingly. But don't lie. Don't fudge it. That will get you into serious trouble. But it really emphasizes the importance of field information even today. The benefits, as Linz sees, for field information, the record is retained. It's not lost. We've got archives full of field books that go back 150 years. They're constantly referred to. We're now in the process of getting those digitized. Most of the North Island field books are done. We're now starting on the South Island field books. So at some point that information will be more accessible, but even then, if you're querying a digitized image, we can go back to the original field note. That will apply to future surveyors 150 years in the future that are interrogating work that we did today. Primary record of field evidence is preserved with the CSD. As I said, it's right on the top of the hierarchy of evidence, and by submitting and retaining those field notes, that evidence is preserved. And I'd add the integrity of the cadaster is protected. Are we not here to protect the interests as professionals for our clients? The evidential value of the field information is respected. You're not only respecting your own professionalism, but you're respecting the work that other surveyors have done. And you can interrogate their field notes to figure out what went wrong, if something went wrong. So, what are we saying about how to apply these new rules? Well, Linz has some guidance for us. So there's the first section of guidance. If you search our website now and go to the knowledge base 935, or just type in something like Cadastral Survey Rules 2021, and it will take you to a link to the guidance. Our staff have been working furiously over the last 2 or 3 months. We're all worn out. I've had to work many late nights just to prepare things like this. That guidance is there for all of us to use. Please use it. And if you're finding it's not helping you, give us some feedback. But at the moment, that's really going to help us implement what we're trying to do. So in terms of field information, it's under the guidance there of content of a CSD. And that answers the question, what is field information and what is permanent usability? And also under that content of a CSD, it talks about this new item, which is water boundary record. And it describes the differences between that and field information and gives some examples. So let's have a look at some of this guidance, just the key points from it. It doesn't specify the form of our field notes, and that's good. The 2010 rules really opened up any kind of technology we can use to do our job. And really, under these rules as well, it's not prescribing exactly how we record our field information, but it gives us the bones or the guidelines that the structure that should be around that form. It should be software independent. We're looking towards receiving field information in an electronic format, not a dumb TIFF format. So we don't want someone to submit field notes that have been done in such a way that no one else can open that file up or interpret that file. It needs to be software independent from the point of view of proprietary software, but be able to be pulled into any standard day-to-day software that can be used to open it up, read it, and then we can manipulate it ourselves. It should preferably be in an electronic readable format for ease of use. And we've got some breaking news for you today. Lyndon's very proud of this. As of the revision of Land Online, 30th of August this year, field information and accurate water boundary record will able to be submitted as a readable colour PDF file format. That's a start, but it means that you can then cut and paste off that file any information that you wish to use. So that's an option. It will also currently read colour TIFFs, and Bruce is going, darn it, but no, we'll get there, Bruce. Marks and measurements must clearly relate to the marks and vectors in the CSD. Now, I've come across this myself in private practice, and you're just out there wanting to get the fieldwork done, so you relate to point numbers. So I'm at 0.5 and I'm shooting 0.6. But in the data set, it's old peg, XYZ, DP, such and such. So, but the problem is there's a disconnect between the field information and the CSD. So we either need to edit that field information when we're back in the office to give the correct names so that it relates to the CSD, or provide a diagram that says this point is this mark, or a list. But the key thing is the field information needs to be able to relate itself to the information that's in the final plan. And it should be as original as possible. Bruce has got some great features in some of the work he's been working on. It's not to say that some reduction goes on and some reduction might go on in the office. We might not want to convert our slope distance to horizontal until we get back to the office. That's fine. That's been going on for the last 150 years when a surveyor tidies up his field notes. But the information that's recorded in the field needs to be as original as possible so that others can figure out what's gone wrong if those measurements don't add up. All measurements and notes made in the field material to establishing the correct definition to the survey. That's what's relevant. We don't need other information, but the key stuff we need to determine the definition and the accuracy of the survey is surely relevant. This includes measurements to any old marks you may find and the new cadastral survey marks that you place. Relevant information is also ties to the occupation, and in Christchurch particularly, this has become incredibly important. The earthquakes have proven that, because often offsets to buildings is what's actually shown where the boundary should be. So recording that occupation information is quite critical. As I've mentioned, independent check measurements should be a critical part of your field information. Prove where those old pegs are and prove where the new pegs are that you've placed. And also an accurate fix of water boundary comes under relevance if you have a new water boundary on your data set. Other information that you may wish to record that might be useful in completing your data set: the type, depth and condition of the survey marks you find, the age, description and occupation. So this is more attribute information. So you've now measured to this point, but now you're describing what that point is. And just a tip there, non-relevant information such as topographical data, which we often do, should ideally be filtered out from the field information submitted with the CSD. And put yourself in the shoes of the other surveyor. You're coming along, you're wanting to find a particular tie in someone's field note. You don't want to have to wade through 200 lines of topo shots and spot heights and things like that. Now, we're not saying you can't do that, but think about the other surveyor. If you don't need it in your field information to be submitted, is there a way that you can put it at the end of your report, cut off your report at that point, or filter it out? So just a tip to keep in mind. Usability. Usability is really defined as being easily read and interpreted by those who may not have a full understanding of the equipment and methods you've used. So can they look at your field information and go, oh, that's what he's done, and then move on from there? That makes it so much easier for everyone else. To be usable, it should leave no doubt as to what was measured, how you measured it, and I think here it says which marks you measured between. So again, identify those marks. These are key tips in the guidance that we need to apply. Field information should include sufficient information to enable others to be able to reduce or confirm measured data. Now, I've come across several mistakes where people have not applied a sea level correction. We now call it ellipsoidal distance its correction. And when you analyse the data, you realise, well, hang on a minute, they've set their base station at 0 when it should be up at 500 metres or 200 metres. So there needs to be enough information for someone else to figure out what you did wrong, essentially. But putting it another way, enough information to prove that you've got it right first time. So enough information for others to be able to reduce those raw measurements is very, very useful and makes that data usable. The direct measurements used in the determination of derived vectors. Now you might say, oh, this is my vector between these 2 points. But it's not actually what was measured. You measured from the base station to that point and the base station to that point. Now it's all very well to say, oh yeah, but I've got the coordinates, I sucked the coordinates out. But how can someone check that? The best way is for your information to be usable, it records the raw measurements that were used to derive the measurement that you've finally shown in your data set. Very easy to do, and I believe quite critical. And just another tip there, including additional reduction and adjustment information is acceptable. You can have your raw field notes, but if you can provide other calc sheets or supplementary diagrams that help interpret that field information, that's a real thumbs up. Now, an example of this, in our old field books, we had the top portion where you recorded all your obs, and then in the bottom portion, if you're good, you had a ruler and you drew your diagram, you labelled your marks. That diagram was worth its weight in gold. It was able to interpret the tabs, the information up above. The form, handwritten traditional field notes, we will never refuse those. Obviously now with electronic equipment, a report that shows raw or reduced data, obviously in a usable format, and it's useful if field information can be grouped into logical sets of observed data. We've been doing this for 150 years. We write in our field book, I'm at this mark, and these are the marks I've measured to. These are my reductions to those marks. Now I'm set up on this mark. You can get the picture. If your field information is grouped into logical sets of data that is consistent with itself, in terms of an observation round, or with GPS, all the measurements done from that base station in the morning, and then when you do your second round of observations, that's grouped logically. It's easy for others to follow. So, what does LINS want? What is acceptable? And what is my time limit at the moment? 5 minutes? Good. Did we cover that? Yes. All relevant measurements and notes made at the time of survey. That's what LINS would like to see. Clear, easy to understand reports and notes presented in a logical format. A description of the equipment and measurement methodology used. That's quite important. Doesn't necessarily have to be in your raw field information. If you've got a standard set of, or a standard office procedure for your field teams to use, that can be in your survey report, and a description of any reductions that you might have used or applied. What would LINS like to see? This is some more of the nice to haves. There are advantages to presenting measured vectors in a bearing and distance format. Now, I know some of us produce coordinates and some of our controllers only produce coordinates. But it's easier to relate to vectors shown in a CSD. You're looking at vectors in the field notes and vectors on the plan. You can go, oh, yeah, I can see what's going on there. It's easier to check against other plans. If you're trying to figure out whether 2 marks are good or not, it's easier to compare the bearing difference and the distance difference than trying to have to do in your head, what do these 2 coordinate sets mean? It's a more intuitive way of looking at the measured data. I think all of us, in all of our careers, have started off by measuring bearing and distance vectors, whether we like it or not. It's only the GNS technology and some of the other spatial technology that's starting to make us think in a different way, but we intuitively think about vectors. And tip there, reporting coordinates as well as measured vectors is acceptable. So field information, just a wee picture here. Here's an information-rich scene out in the field. I've just highlighted a couple of really key critical elements here. Got the manual field book for supplementary notes and the electronic field book for recording all the measurements and some of the coding that goes on in this data set. One other little item I will point to, and that's the barometer here. Why? Because this is obviously a job that's at altitude, and we need to know what the altitude is to get the sea level correction. So we need to have set of information and measurement parameters that's going to be useful for that setup. We'll also record the mark information, the independent checks if we need to, and there's an old mark here, and there was 2 other new marks that were placed off this setup. They need the independent checks under them, and any other information that might help, such as the peg there's in a ring of rocks. Can't quite see it here, but a description of the occupation that's along the edge of the bushline there. So just in summary then, clearly recorded field information. We'll go into some of this in some of the later presentations. Supported by meaningful diagrams to help us interpret that information. Shows us what the adjustments were, the reductions, the bearing misclosed there and how it was distributed. That all provides confidence in the CSD. So in summary, field information has high evidential value and importance. It's right at the top there. It's part of the official record, and by retaining it from now on, it will continue to be part of the official record. It must now be included in the CSD and must include all relevant field measurements and information. And finally, it must be in a usable form. So, how's my timing, Andrew? Good. Because there is another section if we get time later about accurate water boundary record, but we'll tease you later with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That was really good. Next up, we've got Melissa Harrington and Bruce Robinson. So I'll just introduce the 2 of them while Tony's sorting out the sound system. So Melissa Harrington. Melissa, or Mel Harrington, is a licensed cadastral surveyor, spending most of her professional career as a surveyor working in post-earthquake Christchurch, down here, for Elliott Sinclair. With a passion for technology and the surveying profession, Mel joined Trimble in 2016 as part of the Rotational Development Program. After 3 years working in the United States in product development with Trimble, Mel's returned to New Zealand and is now Technical Operations Manager of the 3 Trimble technology distributors in New Zealand: Altera, SciTech, and Building Point New Zealand. Now, Bruce Robinson. Bruce graduated from survey school in May 1989. And is 1989, and is licensed to the Cadastral Surveyor in both South Africa and New Zealand. He's Director of Global Survey and is responsible for their survey and reality capture sales and support team. He's active in Survey and Spatial New Zealand, very active, and is currently Chair of the Positioning and Measurement stream. Right, so the format for this is we have some questions that we're going to put to our 2 people here, and then we'll get their answers.
Yeah. I'd like also just to add that these are pre-prepared questions, so we pretty much know what we're going to answer, but if you want to spice it up a bit, you can ask some from the floor.
Right. So our first question, most instrumentation has the ability to create a report of electronic field measurements these days. For those who are not currently creating field notes or want their instrumentation to deliver an electronic field note, what things do we need to be thinking about to develop the report or the field book directly from our instrumentation?
So I think there's 2 things that you should start off by thinking about. So what's the end goal? What are you trying to report on? So Tony gave some really good examples then of sort of what information you can report on. And then you need to think about how are we going to get there in terms of recording that information in the field. And so how I'd look at it is like what point information am I capturing in the field? So you need to think about point numbering, feature code libraries. For those who aren't familiar what a feature code library is, it's you're writing in an iron tube, and when you process it in the office, it will draw that symbol and things. So it's just a way to capture a lot of information in the field controller easily. And then from there, you can do whatever you need from the data collector in terms of reporting and things.
Yeah, I just add to that a little bit. You've also got to think about what technology you're using to capture that data and how you're going to capture it, because the question is how do I do a field note of a static survey? So that just needs to be taken into balance a little bit. And so what do LINs require for a static survey? And maybe it's just that you've done a static survey, so maybe there are some questions that need to be asked back of field notes or something like that. Tony, do you have anything to comment on static surveys?
Yeah, we obviously don't want all the the Rhinex files or anything like that. Just a note in the field the survey report that those vectors were measured by static, or even on your reduction diagram that they're static obs, and obviously the quality of them, because any static reduction will give you the RMSs of the coordinates.
Okay. Right, next question. A number of manufacturers create reports via a style sheets output. What are style sheets?
What's a style sheet? Okay, this is quite a long answer to quite a short question. Is a style sheet? What a style sheet does is, let's go back. You log data into your proprietary database format, and then what will happen when you run a style sheet against that database? What it does is, excuse me, it goes through and converts that to XML, and then your style sheet reads your XML and produces in something that's readable in a format that you want. And that could be XML, will be able to be converted to what the style sheet says it's going to convert it to. So that could be PDF, it could be TIFF, it could be HTML, it could be CSV, it goes on, it could be field file, just goes on. So a style sheet is the converter of the raw data via XML.
I'll try and answer that simply.
Sorry.
No. So the way to see a style sheet is simply a reformatting program or a reformatting tool. So you have a good example, just to build on what Bruce said, is you have your raw field data, you run it against a style sheet, and then you get the output format that you desire. Just a sort of simple equation using a reformatting program or tool, also known as a style sheet.
Actually, I'm just going to add a little bit more too. No, it's all right. I've got a mic thing. Just one thing to realise about style sheeting is that it's quite low-level programming language. So it's really cool, because then you can program it to do things, but don't expect to do it quickly. It won't run that programming quickly, and that's why I mean it's low level. So if you want to do complex calculations, you can do it in style sheets, but you just got to be really patient for the result to pop up.
Okay. How do I create my own style sheet? What sort of software do I need? And is it even possible?
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess to create a style sheet, you can sort of start from scratch, or you could edit a pre-existing style sheet that a manufacturer has already created. There's already a lot of pre-existing style sheets that do exist. If you were creating your own or editing one, you just need a basic text editor program. I think both Bruce and I would probably recommend something like Notepad or, yep. And then from there, you just need to have your good data, like a good example data set, the XML file format, and then the XML schema.
Yeah. There's only four things you need. And it's all free. Okay, so you need a decent Notepad editor. Notepad++ is what I would use, or which I do use. You need to have the XML schema, which the XML schema tells you what you're looking for. So I want to export a northing. Well, what's a northing? In the case for us, it's N for northing. So you have to know what you're looking for. So the schema tells you that. Then you have to have an XML reader, so you can open up an XML document and find where your northing or N is, because it's in a path. And so when you call it, you have to know where the path is. And the last thing you need and you need plenty of it, patience. Sorry, can I just actually, I just want to add a little bit more to that. And this goes a little bit deeper actually, in the fact that actually, yes, you can edit style sheets, but you can't take a Trimble style sheet and make it work for Leica. And vice versa, it's like we can't take a land online XML version and make that just work for Leica, because the XML is actually split into two parts. There's the land XML part, land XML 1.2, which is across all parts of land XML. Everybody uses that part, but then everyone who uses XML has their own version of XML that sits underneath that. So what you do is, when it might be N or Northing, N for Northing and Leica, it may be, I don't know what it is in Trimble, but it might be Northing. So you can't just think that because you've got a XML file that you can just going to be able to convert it, because not all paths are the same, depending on the manufacturer, depending on what they're trying to get out.
Should we have a question?
Yeah.
Everyone can hear me.
No, it's for the live stream.
Right, Tony, I've got a question for you. Just so everyone doesn't go and start, programming 101 as soon as this is over. Have you, or has Lynn's had a chance to look at the major brands out there who produce the field notes and through some sort of style sheet, and actually, I don't know, put a stamp on it saying, yes, this is acceptable to some degree? Or is that something that you will be looking at doing in conjunction with the providers?
Yes, we have, and we have been approached by firmware developers and suppliers. Bruce is a good example. He sent some information through to us and say, hey, this is what we're thinking of doing. The other way it can happen, and it happened with Trimble's style sheet, where surveyors were trying to generate a field note. They weren't sure whether it was the right option. They sent it into Lynn's and said, hey, is this good enough? But yeah, I think watch that space. I think as we move towards electronically readable files, it might be good to get some standardized formats. But yeah, it's really, at the moment, the Surveyor General wants the survey community to work with their hardware and software providers to get that solution. What we don't want is 100 inquiries coming, can we do this, can we do this? It's far better if there's only probably, half a dozen sets of typical equipment out there. So if people could work with their vendors to come up with really good solutions for all the users of that particular equipment, then Lynn's is only going to receive 4 or 5 formats instead of 100, 200.
Right, next one. Do you think that it's okay for a field book report, do you think it is okay to create a field book report from your office software?
Yes.
No.
I think so. Bruce and I have made an effort to be pretty brand neutral on our answers, but for this, I can only speak to what I know about Trimble. So obviously, Bruce, I won't get annoyed if you answer differently at all. But when you are using Trimble equipment, the Office software Trimble Business Centre keeps a record of that raw field observation information, the job file. That's the proprietary Trimble format. And so in Business Centre, you have the option to run the same style sheets that you would run in the field. And it's against that true field record. You cannot run the style sheets against your edited field data. And then in addition to that, within the software, there's a number of other reports that are valuable for surveyors. So, for example, a point derivation report if you've been using a combination of GPS and total station to calculate. And that, of course, would be after potentially some field edits. But there's a lot of reporting functionality in the Office software that can be added as part of the supplementary information that you provide alongside your field notes and, of course, the data you submit to the CSD for Land Online.
Yeah, I think no. Because to me, a field note is a field note is a field note. It does beg the question, that's why I asked the question about static data, because what is the field note? But really, I think I do agree with what Mel is saying, that, it's horses for courses a little bit, and it depends how you've captured and what you need to do to process it. But to me, the fundamental thing is a field note comes from the field.
Okay, do you believe there is a place for manual booking of field notes still?
I'm trying not to laugh. Yeah, so I actually think there's definitely a place for still manual booking of field notes if that's what you do. That really depends what equipment you're running. But my personal opinion is you shouldn't have to take a field book into the field. You have a controller, you should have a decent controller. And if you have a decent controller, you don't need a field book. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I can probably add to that. So yes, I agree. It's very dependent on the technology that you're using. So you might be using a mechanical total station or something that doesn't record the digital information. Then I also think about the term like fit for purpose. So it might be that it is a lot easier to jot a field note down, like for a tape measurement or something, than recording it in your data collector. But as a technology advocate, and I think a lot of it is still very possible to do everything in the data collector, but I guess it's up to the surveyor too on what they want to do.
So do you think, in summary, is it sort of like a bit of a whatever's most efficient and just a matter of choice and what equipment you're using and that sort of thing?
I would like to say that what LINs are trying to achieve is not change the way you do a survey. And we need to look at what the fundamental driver is behind this. And it's not to change the way you do a survey. It's to gather more records that are relevant. And so I don't think people should be wholesale changing necessarily what they do, but maybe it's a good chance to reevaluate the way they do things. And that's probably what I would be saying.
Okay, that's the end of my first group of questions. We've got a little bit of time. Are there any more questions from the floor? Or I have some other questions I can ask if you like, if there's nothing else. And we don't have anything. No, I'm looking at that. There's nothing else.
That's good.
Okay, I'll carry on. So perhaps this leads on from the last question. It says, what can be recorded electronically? Shall we skip that, or have we done enough? You reckon everything?
Yeah, I tend to think everything can be recorded electronically. You just have to be smart about the way you do it.
Yeah. I think in terms of like this field software and what it does, I think maybe a better question is almost like how long's a piece of string? That the data that the data collector is receiving is getting everything that you're doing. It's like a true log of the field work. So everything, let's take a point, for example, if you're measuring it with GPS, it's recording your base information as well as the rover information and the vector information in between, the heights, the type of measurement you're taking, whether it be a topo point or a observed control point. It will also record all of the satellites you've used, the horizontal precisions, vertical precisions, RMS, all of that information you'd ever want is being used by the data collector to get the position, and all of that information could be included in a report if you need it.
Okay, how would you cross-reference a point ID numbers with CSD mark names? Is there an easy way to do that?
Yeah, I've looked at this a little bit, but I'm not deep enough. But the thing I've come back to myself is, do people do that now with what they submit, from their field notes? So what I'm trying to say, is this actually relevant for a field note? Because we're not trying to fix the broken land online, we're trying to help. So while it may be good information, is it truly relevant for a field note? Yeah.
It comes under that classification of what LINs would like to see. Is it acceptable? If someone can look at your measurements in your field notes and figure out which marks that was between and which vector on the CSD it is, then it's probably not essential. A lot of stuff of what we've been doing up until now has been a bit like that for the submissions of the field notes that we get, and they can be interpreted. But obviously, if the cross-referencing is there, it makes it much easier for the end user. Otherwise, you have to go hunting, where does this match from here to here?
Can I just add a bit more of this? One of my concerns about producing a field note is actually keeping the field notes to a manageable size. because there's a lot of information that you're recording in the field and can capture in the field, and it's a balance act between giving you enough information, and when I say you, I mean Lynn's, enough information, and a lot of this, while we can develop style sheets and work with style sheets, I suppose it's you people out there have to decide what you want to put in your style sheet, right? And I keep saying that to our customers I've talked to. It's not my style sheet, it's your style sheet, right? So while we can help with some of this sort of stuff, you also have to make the decision what you think you want to submit to Lynn's. It's not ours, it's yours.
I think sort of going back to the question about how do you reference like the peg name, the true name from its original plan, it's entirely possible to do that if you've done your like pre-calculations, say, and labeled it, and then you can put that in as the feature code or the note. And then in terms of like, yes, taking it even further, if you wanted, you could potentially even note down like the node ID of that point inland online if it was that essential. But I don't think anyone does that in their pre-calculations anyway, just the name. So, but yeah, it's entirely possible to capture that information in your feature coding and things like that.
Okay, I've got one more question. Well, maybe not. I'm just thinking perhaps I'm starting to get a few Slido questions coming through, so perhaps I should pick up some of these. There's a few of these, so we might look at it. Some of them that we don't get through at this stage at the end under the panel discussion. But I'll ask one now. It says, do the panel have any thoughts on using photos as part of field notes?
I think photos are like, it says 1,000 words, right? You saw the slides from Tony before indicating like the state of a peg and things like that. Also like occupation information. And it's entirely possible with the data collectors today to take photos and attach them. Or if you're using your phone, you can also sync it back and attach it as a note to the controller. In terms of submitting it to land online and things, I can't really speak to that because it depending on the image size line, if you were to upload thousands of images, but yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yep, got to use them.
Okay.
That's the technology, we've got to look to what technology can do for us, and going forward, there'll be even more different sorts of technology that we may be able to submit with our data sets, right? We've got now iPhones that scan, right? So imagine you could actually get a scan, so you could actually see the depth of the hole and stuff like that. So you've got to think, can't think about where we are now or where we were. We've got to think about where we're going to be. So we need to be taking everything we can get and being able to chuck that at the software. That's my thoughts.
Okay, well, we're pretty much just about out of time, and we probably should try and stick to time. I know you guys are keen for a break, but Bruce has got one question to ask people before.
Yeah, because I've been thinking about this for a while since we've been in discussion, and so this is my personal opinion. Okay, I'll just give it straight away. This is my personal opinion. So what we currently have is we have this current cadastral process where you capture some information, typically your cadastral and your topographic information, you chuck it into a bit of software, and in the end, you send some cadastral information to land online. And what I think we need to think about with these field notes is Lynn's are not trying to change your work processes, right? So nothing's going to change, okay? You're going to do exactly the same thing. So then where does the field book sit? Well, in my opinion, the field book sits here. It sits between your processing software and land online. So what I'm saying is you do everything you've always done. This may be a good conversation for you to have over your morning tea. Maybe your cadastral field note is actually part of your QA tool, right? So what we do is we take directly from, this is why I say field information, directly from the instrument, and we skip your processing software and we use it as your QA tool to look back to make sure what your processing software has done is what you wanted it to do, okay? And this field note should be part of your QA process, have all your occupational info in it, your notes, and even reduced observations that the instrument can do for you. So that's my 2 minutes before morning tea. Okay, something to think about. Cheers.
Right, thank you very much, both of you, Bruce and Mel. That's good. Now, morning tea time, so that's just going to be outside here. Everyone online can go and make their own cup of tea back in their office. And then if you could, we're 10:30 now, so we'll try and start again at 11 o'clock. So if you can be back here then. Thank you.
Wait for Andrew to kick things off. Are you doing an intro or no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the time now? Is it
10:59.
about 2 minutes till? Or?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Right, welcome back. We've now got 2 presenters, practitioners, or 1 practitioner, 1 ex-practitioner. So you've heard from Tony, so I won't reintroduce him, but Erin Cameron is a licensed cadastral surveyor and director of surveying for Envelope in Wellington. She has over 13 years experience in the survey profession in New Zealand, Australia, Canada and the UK. Her experience in New Zealand and Australia has involved working for surveying and engineering consultancies with a focus on cadastral surveying and leading survey teams. And in Canada and the UK, she worked mainly with contractors on civil construction projects, doing set out and supervision work. So if you give these 2 a warm welcome, please, Erin and Tony.
Cool, thanks, Andrew. All right, morning everyone. Yes, I've been back from the UK for about 4 years now, and as Andrew said, well, I spent most of that time working for engineering surveying consultancy with an awesome bunch of surveyors across the country. And towards the end of last year, got an opportunity I couldn't refuse to set up a survey team up in Wellington, which has been really exciting. So that has been an awesome experience to go through and think about cadastral surveying workflows and how I wanted to set things up, and especially thinking about the QA process as a licensed surveyor, how I wanted that whole process to come through to the final dataset submission. So I've looked at, with Bruce's help, refining that electronic fieldbook output at the end of that process. So I'll go through that and an example at the end. So the best part about setting up a surveying team was getting back in the field. It's what we all get into it for. Love being outside. And it was also exciting to get my hands on some shiny new technology. So had a look at all of the options really, and decided to go with the newest thing that Leica had to offer in the end. Just with the advances in technology and the efficiencies that it can bring and the depth of data that you can get out of getting the latest kit. So yeah, developing processes from scratch, opportunity to take the best bits of field notes and records that I've used at multiple consultancies and try and work that into the most efficient and workflow that I thought would work best. It's me set up in Canada a few years back, so didn't fancy getting my notebook out at -20. So even with a bit of old TopCon technology, with the help of a labourer who knew a bit of programming, was trying to get my control survey data out of that machine without having to book it. Because yeah, these MITs don't really work well for jotting down notes. So yeah, keen to set up systems for efficiency from field through to office and give the licensed surveyor, give myself confidence in everything that's gone on right through to the end. So the first first 3 years back from the UK, I was largely a desk jockey and working on some big data sets, and not sometimes getting to go out in the field at the outset of a project just for a bit of a recce, but often, as we do, relying on field staff to collect all the information. So it was a good insight into what I wanted to see for the QA process and what I needed to satisfy myself that everything had gone on as it should have. So yeah, confidence in what's been measured, what's been found, independent checks have been carried out, that the rules have been met. Great, like communication and coordination with the field staff for check-in points is really important too. So, you know, once you've done that first recce and what evidence you've gathered, coming back and making sure you're happy with the definition before they charge it, go and start whacking pegs in the ground. So, yeah, being back in the field in the last 6 or 8 months has really helped fine-tune, how you pick it up in the field so it flows through to that process. So yeah, getting to know my way around the new equipment again and trying to get efficient, and then making sure it's captured in a way that the outputs back in the office are easily digestible, basically. Easy to read and easy to follow for QA processing, and also, a good record for repeatability. So, no more coming back to the office and trying to tidy up a field note and get a perfectly looking diagram and all that kind of thing through your dinner. We're basically, trying to produce something in the field, the garbage in, garbage out theory. So doing your calcs with your point IDs, and I think Tony and Bruce touched on it. Definitely a big fan of having the legal description in there as well before you go out into the field. Having that in there at the start means the output is always linked to it. So refining that field book so it's got your point ID, but it's also got that legal description for the QA processing just makes it so much easier. And actually links, like we spoke about, to the data on the CSD plan that you're picking up that vector data. So also wanted it to show that appropriate methodologies are being used. So got some pretty standard methodologies which is sort of industry practice for GNSS observations, and making sure, like Mel touched on, that the right things to show that we're using those methodologies correctly are coming out through that field book. Also, being able to show what was found and what wasn't, and making sure that any surveyor now or in the future can go back through and understand what we've done. Not quite the garbage in, garbage out I was referring to, but a good use for a GPS pole if you accidentally throw your keys in the wheelie bin. Just this week as well. All right, so just got one example from a survey I did, a 2-lot subdivision I did this week. So this is a few snips of what our electronic field book looks like. It's kind of got your, can you see it? Got your standard job number and date, operator, coordinate system, and then moves into the first thing that your base at the top here. So I was only K.5 from a SmartFix base. So testing that theory a bit, got pretty good accuracies and repeatability at that distance. So just used the SmartFix base. So the first thing we did is gone out and found our existing control marks for orientation. So this is just pumping out the bearings and distances, ellipsoidal distances from the base. It's got point ID, the legal description and the code come straight out of the calcs, and then so the controller that we've got takes photos as well, and this all links automatically to the point when you output the field book. So when we finish our day in the field, USB straight into the controller before we shut everything down, take off all the raw data files, a field file that goes straight into our processing software, photos, and this field book. It comes out from the field, and that's the record directly from the field. Still come back to the office and we'll often draw up a vector diagram. So still got that hand-drawn vector diagram of the final Travis combination of GNSS and total station often. So yeah, this is just working through our GNSS observations. I don't usually probably take as many photos, but I took quite a few for this example. But especially if you find a really old mark, that's the most exciting bit, right? So capture that, put it in there. Everyone wants to see it when you get back to the office. But yeah, for marks not found, there was a boundary disk there. It might have been chipped away by a sweeper or something. So, and yeah, in the code, just put not found. So you've got a record, a measured vector to it, but it wasn't there. So that photo just kind of helps back that up as well. So no one's mistaking that you've actually measured something there. But yeah, again, pretty key, garbage in, garbage out. If you just measured that and someone took it to be a measured vector, you might get in trouble. Yeah, again, another mark not found, just took a photo of the curb destroyed right in that spot. So nice, clear understanding for anyone looking at it of why you couldn't measure it. I've also got, oh yeah, this one here. So I've measured a control mark that was too close to a building to rely on. But I've given it a measure anyway and just put a code, no GPS. So we know if we're going to go and peg something else, then don't rely on that with the GPS. You have to get the total station out or use something else. And then yes, just a stakeout. This is like a stakeout report at the end. So coordinate comparison to your calc position. So again, it like as an LCS checking that, just a quick rundown of those residuals gives you a good idea of how well things came in. And then at the end of that round of A observations, I quite often run an inverse on some plan vectors. So between some observed points that relate back to a plan vector. So that's what that is there. So haven't got the codes there. Might ask Bruce to add those in, but you could cross-reference it to the top. So yeah, that's a quick check on the bearing and distance. Able to have a look at the plan and go, yep, happy with my orientation, and then go back and do it again after the B vectors just to check on your repeatability, your independent check. So yeah, use pretty standard methodology for A and B for your first measurement and your independent check, and still in the habit of, oh yes, the total station. So yeah, got the total station out to place the pegs because they weren't all GPSable. So yeah, all your data comes through from your controller for serial number and equipment used. And then yeah, your left and right face bearings and spheroidal distances come out in this output as well. Still in the habit of calling total station stuff with a TS from previous forms where you couldn't differentiate between the GPS and total station observations, but this obviously is a really nice chronological order of your setups and what you've observed. So all the total station stuff, like Tony was saying, is grouped together. GNSS vectors grouped together. And then, yeah, picked up some occupations, so taken a few context photos of that as well. And yeah, it all, like I said, all links back to that point that you took. So you can, yeah, go and take a photo of the fence line there, and then it'll link to that point. Yeah, so that's stakeout results from the total station and some check shots with the GPS at the end as well. So I was able to double tie some of the pegs placed with the total station with the GPS. Good independent check, and then another total station set up to set double tie the other pegs that weren't GPSable. That's not from the survey, but another example of probably a standard control vector diagram. You usually have the similar to what Tony showed before, the plan vector comparisons where it's in an existing line as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it for our output. Yeah, like I said, it's been a great opportunity to firstly work in the office as a signing surveyor with a team under me for a good few years, and then get back out into the field and try and do it myself and understand all the bugbears that I was getting told about, and try and iron those out. Awesome to play with some new technology. Like, highly recommend, just if you can, getting as new a technology as possible, because it's it definitely brings efficiency. Having used quite a range of Trimble, like a TopCon, all sorts of gear here and overseas. And it's a really straightforward process to, with the help of your hardware providers, to get something that is a really, really easy output, as long as you get those field processes right. And yeah, results in a really digestible form that's good for QA and good for LINS records and for any future surveyor picking it up. Any questions? Any Slido ones?
They all go back to before UNT. That's questions.
Cool.
Any questions around the room before we move on?
I know Tony's got lots more examples. So it's obviously just one, but he's got plenty of other forms.
What have you submitted in terms of your data set to Land Online, just with those reports you've given us?
So for the field note, just that, a PDF. That was probably about 12 pages. A PDF printed from the HTML form that comes out, which is, and that a vector diagram. Well, once I submit that data set, it'll be that control diagram as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Andrew.
Don't worry, it's not a question, it's more of a statement. I think what you've done there in terms of that field report or field information, it's absolutely fabulous, because in the new rules, we've got requirements to record if a mark is searched for and not found as an electronic attribute in Land Online. So when your recording is not found, you'll know straight away to set that in Land Online. And also we've got another requirement in the rules. If you are required to place a ground mark, but you can't, you need to set it to impractical to mark.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be another one. You might even take a photo showing how it was impractical to mark. So that fits really well with some of the other requirements in the rules.
Yeah. Cool.
Any others?
Slido ones.
Got one that's come through from Slido. Was that 12 pages for a 2-lot subdivision?
Yeah. Yeah.
So plenty of field notes.
Yeah, probably a question to Tony on size of, or LINS to size of file as well.
Well, as long as you can upload it into LINS, there's no limitation. With the dumb TIFFs, obviously they used to take a lot more memory size, but you'll find out from the groundbreaking PDFs that we're now able to lodge, they'll be very, very small in size. So you could have a 50-page report if you wanted. I think as long as it's easy and structured, I don't think people necessarily need to print these out. They're just wanting to scroll through them and find the information they want. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we wouldn't ordinarily print it. Got way bigger issues with big data from scanning in drones than a 12-page PDF. So as long as you can work through and understand what's going on, then that's the main thing for us.
Okay, shall we move on to Tony?
Is that good? I'll just change slideshows. So, I was asked to speak. It's on Lynn's letterhead, but you'll have to excuse that. Some examples from private practice, many years of tinkering and several hours of R&D and playing around. I've always tried to get the best out of my equipment and also get some really sensible workflows that produce consistent results, so I don't have to scratch my head at the end of the day. So here is an example of an early electronic produced fieldbook report. It's the AT1202 antenna there. Originally we started with a System 500, Bruce, back in the good old days. And I think Richard can take credit for helping us produce this report. Very simple, but it was a first attempt at showing how we could bring out a grid bearing and ellipsoidal distance instead of a pair of coordinates. And yeah, it's probably lacking some information in terms of quality, but it does record the time of the observation. And you'll see there that it's only 24 seconds. This is actually the pole getting rotated between 15 epochs and 15 epochs, whatever it was that we were doing at the time. And then further down, obviously, there would be a B750, which would be the second occupation, and we would compare those. But yeah, crude and elementary, but it's got the serial numbers of the equipment, the date, the job, all the basic information there. And it's just a matter of whether you think there should be anything else. You'll probably notice there the mark descriptions are not, and that's actually a trig, that Woodstock, they're not necessarily numbered the way we would like. Those pegs would now have individual numbers on them. Good first attempt back in the good old days. And yeah, just highlighting there those pairs of observations that would be averaged into one vector for the occupation. Along with that, sometimes we used to submit this to confirm the coordinate quality, because that other report didn't have coordinate quality. And there's a little bit more information. It's actually giving the ellipsoidal height of the measured points to confirm that we were applying sea level correction correctly. So what we used to do is just download our raw data out of the data recorder into a product called Like a Geo Office at the time, and let that do all the smarts in terms of the adjustment to produce the coordinates. And then the software will also then produce that style sheet or format that Richard helped us with. Moving on from that, I tried to get our vectors presented to Lynn's in a field book format that more closely represented the bearings and distances with other information, tabulated all in a nice, and I did this in portrait format so you could get a whole heap of vectors on one sheet. And essentially, at the back end of the sheet, there was one sheet that you just cut and paste the raw CSV data out of the data recorder, and it would convert it into this. And to be honest, I've used that spreadsheet for many, many years as part of my GPS field notes, I used to call them, that I used to submit. It has the datum information, the date, who the surveyor was, the job reference, and it's rounding the vectors to sensible limits here. So obviously anything that's over 2 kilometres was rounded to 0.1 of a second. And that's needed because if you're trying to check a rover-to-rover vector that's been derived from these original base-to-rover vectors, you just take out the missing lines. But if you've rounded it to 1 second and you've got a 10-kilometre vector, then you're going to start to get some errors just in terms of your rounding, so eliminating those rounding errors. Here's an early attempt at a coordinate comparison quality report, basically dump into my third-party software set A observations in a layer, dump in the set B observations, then ask the software to say, look for any points that are within 0.5 metre of each other and flag anything that's more than 5 millimetres out. And so you'll see there the 10D to C101 and the 101D to D101. It's saying, hey, those measurements are 11 millimetres different than what expected. All within minimum, tick, 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 tick. Obviously, once they're getting out to 03, 04, if it's a Class A survey, you're going to go, might have to go and do another occupation. But easy to do. Yeah, just highlighting there the tolerances. Here's an early total station measurement report. Again, job details up at the start here. The height of the instrument, which is critical if you're applying sea level corrections. And you'll see here it's doing a series of measurements. That's the backside measurement, obviously. Then you've got face left, face right, and the mean coming through here. And you'll see, probably due to my age and the fact that at the time this was being done, not everything was recorded completely electronically. I think what we're really good at of our electronic reports is if we start doing bearing adjustments on a traverse. So obviously, as you go around your traverse, you end up with a misclose at the end. How do you demonstrate that in terms of your reduced data? Well, here's a crude manually entered correction. 8 seconds was applied to that one. Further down, you will see it was 13 seconds and then 15 seconds because each setup, you're trying to distribute that cumulative misclose so that when you get back to the start, your bearings close. And also they're just recording what that shot was to. It was to peg 12, to peg 8, to peg 9. Combination of something that was electronically reported and then scribbled over the top for the final field note. Moving on, we then got some help from the software suppliers. Alan Worthington of Trimble helped us generate this one. And it stood the test of time. We're still using that up until the time I left the office and moved to Lynn's. But you'll see it's reporting the information in an easy to read format, intuitively. Because this is GPS data, we've now got more information coming in terms of reporting the quality of the measurement, whereas before it was just showing the measurement and no idea of what the quality was. So you've got your horizontal vertical precisions, which as we know are only an estimate, but they're a good guide. If you saw those numbers going, then you know that something's blowing out in terms of the initialization. The PDOT, number of satellites, I think is quite good information if you're analyzing someone's measured data, and the time of the measurement. So yeah, a way of summarizing that information. And you'll see there, again, looking at the times of the obs, that's rotating the pole 180 degrees. And I've done this throughout my career because I find I like diagrams. I like seeing what I've done and what I've measured. And so doing a sketch, I call these my reduction diagrams. I actually attach them to my field notes. It summarizes the raw measurements that are recorded in the GPS reports that we've seen previously. And then it shows there was one measurement there that was flagged as poor under the C occupation. But then the final result that I was going to use in the data set. And I think some of these you'll see here where there was a previously measured distance, you also record what the previous one was that you're comparing now against your new measurements. And you'll see here as well, point IDs here are cross-referenced to the actual mark names. So that was my way of connecting the dots between the point numbers and the mark names. Just when you're submitting your field notes to Lynn's, you can do little things like adding in here that was your check made against, that's the calculated tie to the peg, that was actually the measured tie, and I've checked it off that it's within tolerance. No measurements exact, but as long as they're getting close and it's within the accuracy tolerance of the rules. And again, highlighting there the elevation for the sea level correction. Probably hear a common theme coming through about sea level correction because I get quite a few of them at work now. And notice here, right at the end of this particular instrument setup, I think it's a really good practice if you're using total station and you're wanting to prove your independent checks above, is to record a backsite or a check site to either your backsite, foresight, or a peg you've placed from another setup, or a mark you've placed from another setup. That provides independent confirmation that all the observations above you haven't kicked one of the legs, or that your orientation has slipped off. Good old rudimentary survey practice that we were taught from day one when we had older theodolites. Here's a supporting reduction diagram, I call them. So again, showing what the total misclose was. That was applying 2 seconds pretty much at every line, 3 seconds at that one because it was a short backsite, 1 second at that one because it was a really nice long backsite. And just showing how the end results that have gone into the data set have been produced from the raw measurements. Those raw measurements are recorded in that combined sheet that we looked at just before. Oops, I made an error. I got my prism correction wrong. So here's a manual correction to the electronic data sheet to confirm what the true measurement should have been. And then I did another setup with the prism correction corrected to make sure I got the same result there, 44.25. Manual field notes, they can be useful, as I said, to help with the cross-referencing of the mark numbers. Or when you come across something like this, where you find an old tube in the Marlborough Sounds that has evidence that someone put a stick of dynamite in the top of it and had some fun with it. The top was just completely blown out. But I thought it was worthy to record because it was a geodetic control mark. So at least I recorded what I considered the disturbance to be. Now that's very hard to do in a data recorder, coding this sort of information. But what you can do nowadays, you've got tablets and you've got styluses. So you could actually draw this as an electronic diagram in your data recorder and not have to carry around a separate manual field book. But just showing that the picture, as we said, is worth 1,000 words. Yeah, just highlighting there the mark cross-referencing. But what Erin was talking about, and I've always believed this, when you've done a lot of R&D and you've come up with a really good work process, then adopt that process and repeat it, because it saves you having to then scratch your head each time a field party's gone out and done some field work. Or what are we dealing with here? So I used to like having standardized procedures, and then that enabled me to put those standardized procedures into the survey report. Doesn't necessarily need to be documented in the field notes themselves. So for example, here, total station, traditional two-face observations with measurements to distance on both directions on all main traverse lines. Observations to new boundary marks have been made on both faces, with a second face serving as an independent check. You know, so I got lazy. I didn't like doing included angle in feet and inches because it used to take forever to reconfigure the total station to do that. So why not just measure the peg again, separate occupation, this is after you hit it in the ground, on face right. But then you can say, well, what's happened if you bump the instrument? But then, of course, bearings would close back onto a previous established mark for any round of observations recording new boundary marks. So you do face right on a backside or foresight at the end of that round, and to me, that's an independent check that I could defend before the licensing board or before a court of law if I had to. And then again, some information about how I went about measuring my GPS. So each point's got at least 30 epochs, 15 each on 180. Well, now we've got tilting poles, I might have to revise this. But you didn't have that sort of tech at that particular stage. And a note there about the base to rover vectors, how I've dealt with those, and the fact that I've considered them to be measured, but they're independently recorded, then averaged, and they're based on at least 2 of these occupations above. So if you've got that process, someone reading the survey report, they can go, oh, I can see how Tony's derived that vector. I can see those coordinate qualities in his measurement report above. That's actually a pretty good measurement. Why is it different? But at least then you can investigate the reason why, but know that you're dealing with a reasonably robust procedure. Yep, just highlighting those 2 points. I was going to show a couple of examples of other field notes, but this is a part we missed in the first part because I ran out of time in the first part, and I did say we might touch on accurate water boundary fix. How much time we got, Andrew?
We've got about 7 minutes.
7 minutes, that's cool. I've got plenty of time. Look at this for groundbreaking technology. Awesome, water boundary fix. What a way to fix a water boundary. Actually quite a good picture, don't you think? Well, what do the rules say about an accurate water boundary? or the position, accurate record of the position of any new water boundary. That's how the rule states it. It needs to provide sufficient information to accurately reproduce the water boundary position. We get the shape by the surveyor's interpretation of how that wavy line moves between the points that we've fixed. So the shape's not quite so critical, but obviously we want to know where the river is, because if we're adopting that water boundary, we want to put it in the right place. If we think that there's been movement to that water boundary, then we need to be able to compare its previous position to where it is now so that we can accurately record the accretion and the erosion. It can be included in the field information, so don't get confused. If you read the guidance on this, your field information might be all you need. You've recorded enough information to accurately locate the water boundary. You don't need a separate water boundary record because all the information's in the first report. But it can be office produced. So if you've done some fancy stuff in your third-party software and you're wanting to simplify data that you've got, then you can produce a report that enables someone else to reproduce that water boundary without having to interrogate your field notes. So the choice is yours, but essentially, the way I see it, an accurate water boundary fix is almost a subset of your field information with maybe a few little bits and pieces added on to the top of it if needed to help interpret where that water boundary is. And again, it needs to relate to common points in the CSD. No point giving us an accurate water boundary fix. Brilliant, we know exactly the shape and the length of it, but where does it fit in the cadastre? So ideally, we need at least 2 points on that water boundary fix. But one of them, if it's a series of radial ties from a known point and we know the orientation is good, then in that case, probably one common point would be sufficient. So our methods for recording water boundary fix, well, as we said, traditional field notes or electronic field note fixes. We've gone along with a GPS, or we've used a total station and then a whole heap of radial ties. If that's well recorded and it's logical and we can interpret it, that's all we need. We don't need anything extra. A list of radiations from a known point, and they can be calculated, or a coordinate listing. And you'll notice here virtual fixes to digitize points from aerial imagery or point cloud data. How are we going, Andrew? Good? Or other acceptable methods. So open book at the moment. This is a new rule, and we're waiting to see what comes in to satisfy this rule. But as long as you can satisfy the earlier points in terms of being able to accurately reproduce it, that's what we're after. So here's an early example, handwritten field book done in 1981. Hands up, yeah, those of you that were born after 1981. You'll see here that there's some information here, and it hasn't tied to the bank. Some of these are offset ties, but it shows the distance to the bank, and it's recording here the measurements 2 meters to bank, right on bank, so in other words on the bank, 5 meters to bank, 3 meters to bank. So there's enough information here, including this offset change and offset tie there, to reproduce that water boundary. So we don't need anything else. The field note is sufficient. And by the way, when we saw earlier the surveyor with his staff, this riverbank was fixed by Stadia. So yep, the staff can still be a useful piece of contactless equipment to measure distances, accurate enough to determine a water boundary. Here's an example here of a GPS field note fixing a water bank, and he's recorded offsets. So yeah, really good. The information's there in terms of the bank shots, but is this enough information to be able to interpret where those offsets go, where they relate to? So I'd say, yes, it's good, but probably not quite there in terms of being able to use directly. We need a bit more information. And this is what the surveyor provided us with. He's from those points that he's cross-referenced in his field notes and on his diagram here. He's saying at point 1423, the riverbank is 8 meters at a bearing of 270 magnetic, because he's used a compass and a disto. So he's taken a GPS shot, he's taken his silver compass out and taken a bearing, and then he's distoed the bank. Simple. But that, with the previous field notes, would now be looking like that's an accurate water boundary fix. And on top of that, he produced a plot to scale of the water boundary as it was fixed. And probably, this is before the new rule, by the way, probably nowadays, I would probably put little crosses here where the actual fixed points were, just to help someone interpret that information. But that's now looking like a really, really good, accurate water boundary fix. Here's an example that you see in the guidance. Surveyors identified Iron Spike 4 as this point where these points are marked. Now that could be actual measured vectors, or it could be calculated. But what he's done is he's tabulated his water boundary fixes from a single point with a series of radiations. But by providing this diagram over here, we can see that the points are in sequence. We're not missing something out, like if you've gone over there and then decided, oh, I need another shot back here. It's in the right sequence so that we can get the shape correct. This is the reality of a situation confronted with from digitized aerial imagery or point cloud. So what we're going to try and do here is determine this side of the river using remote sensing techniques, because this is quite a deep cut gorge. You would drown yourself trying to cross that river. And the dense vegetation on this side prevents distoing it or determining this position by any other means. So it was flown with a drone. The 3D point cloud was produced, as well as an ortho photo, but guess what? The ortho photo, you got overhanging vegetation. But the surveyor here was clever enough to fly oblique imagery as well, to be able to detect the bank underneath the imagery in the 3D point cloud. So you've got your vegetation hanging over the top, but you can see the bank underneath. So how are we going to record these digitized points in an accurate water boundary record? We don't want to submit the point cloud to LINS, that's pointless. Far too many of them. Well, here's your options. You could calculate a series of virtual ties from a null point, by the way, or another known point, and do a radial report, just like we've seen above. Or you could produce a coordinate list, and providing it's in sequence, so if you've got identifiers to know where those points are, that would be also an acceptable way of recording that water boundary fix. I'd like to suggest that a scale plot with registration points would also qualify. Some of my counterparts in LINS, we've got an interesting debate about that one, but it's worth thinking about if you're trying to produce a nice line for someone else to reproduce in the future. And as I said there could be other options. So in this case, this is what I actually did. I produced an accurate plot of the water boundary. You'll see it's to scale. It's got no distortion, which was what we don't want in land on line, so that's fine. There's the other side of the riverbank there, and it's got common points that are captured into the CSD. So anybody could actually upload that image from what's in land online now, register it and digitize off it and get an accurate reproduction of that water boundary, which is what we're after. Now, the breaking news that Lyndon told us about earlier, what I really wanted to submit into land online was this, but I couldn't. But now you can. So isn't that awesome? So now you can actually produce the ortho photo with the water boundary overlaid. And again, if I was doing this today, I would probably have little crosses here where those water boundary fixes, the virtual fixes, were. How's that, Andrew? Because I think that's the finish. Oh, summary. A water boundary record accurately defines the water boundary position. Why? To be able to accurately be reproduced in the future. It can be included in the record of field information, in which case just submit that, and in your survey report say water boundary record included in field notes. It can be office produced, so if you're doing some smarts or remote sensing, just give us enough information, not the whole point cloud, sufficient information to be able to do that reproduction, and it can be supplemented by diagrams and scale plots. Now we've run out of time. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Are there any immediate questions, or we're just about to move on to the panel discussion? So it'd be basically a question type opportunity anyway. So we've got a few that have come through on the Slido, so we might start with those on the panel discussion. But if I can ask all the presenters to come up.
Oh, Bruce, come this way, sorry. Perhaps, let's see. Oh, it doesn't matter which way.
I'll just sit by these questions. Might just start with some questions on the Slido that have come through. A couple of them are directed to individual people. So we've got a couple that go back to Erin's presentation. Says, Erin, would you also lodge a hand-drawn diagram?
Oh, yeah, I think I answered that one. Yeah, a control traverse diagram of the final vectors. Yep.
Cool. There was another one here for Erin. How do you get the information from the controller into your processing software? Is it via these printouts, or are you also uploading other data into your software?
Yeah, so there is other data that comes out. It's another a style sheet, so transforming that raw data into a format that's suitable to go into the processing software. So at the same time that we take off that field book file, we're taking off another style sheet that goes into the processing software, as well as all the raw data information to be able to reproduce that project later on.
Thank you. Are marked out printouts of standard format reports correcting things like mark naming, etc., an acceptable way of getting around the challenge? Perhaps Tony.
Yeah, sure, if it's clear. Like if you're trying to cross out an error or something that's being remeasured and you don't want the wrong measurement to be interpreted. Or if you're trying to identify point names, there's no reason why you can't mark up a report that's come out of an electronic form.
While I've got you here, also another one. Will the field notes become a requisitionable item? If so, what elements, e.g. readability, accuracy standards, etc., do you expect this to increase CSD processing times? It's quite a pointed question.
Yeah, I wonder whether I should defer commenting on that one. To be honest, at this stage, what's different? At the moment, we've got about 20% of surveyors lodging field information with their data sets. We don't drill into that. We don't interrogate that. What we're wanting is the professional that's within you to present something, if you remember Schedule 2 of the Act, something that's correct, interpretable, and has no error. Now, we're going to accept that on face value. So what we're really going to be doing is checking that the field note's there. What could happen 10, 15 years in the future is we find a conflict. And then we might have to interrogate the field notes. And if we find out that the error was in your field notes, then you might get a Section 52 or a Section 71D. And you might even have to go and front up before the board. How good will your evidence be in front of the board? So short answer is no, we're not going to be interrogating them deeply or requisitioning on them, but consequences could come out of it if your data is wrong.
Okay, thank you. This might be more of a comment, or I'll just read it out anyway. Reference has been about what LINZ wants. When deciding what you're going to submit to comply with the rule, a change of perception to, will this help protect me and the integrity of my survey, and will it be helpful to others following on my steps, is likely to result in a better product. So I guess that's, yeah, just a different way of looking at it, and probably quite a good way to look at it. Will examples of acceptable electronic field recording, both total station and GPS, be made available by LINZ as references? We're probably pretty much doing that now.
Yeah, I think so. We're slowly building up a database of sample plans. There aren't any sample plans at the moment under field information. Obviously, we're not under the new rules yet. We're about to be. But if you have some good examples, by all means, let us know. But we would hope that at some point, some examples will be posted.
Getting quite a few questions coming through at the moment, but maybe we'll have a bit of a break from this and get back to we'll come back to them in a little while. So perhaps we'll go back to our panel discussion rather. And we've got some pre-prepared questions, so I'll just ask this, and perhaps we can get some comment from all of the people, or in some cases maybe the answer is obvious at this stage. I don't know, but I'll read it out anyway. What should we be recording for GNSS measurements, and is there a benefit to recording vectors rather than coordinates? I think we've heard yes. Does this depend on whether there is a local base or an off-site coordinate? Any comments from anyone?
I think if you're using a network solution as opposed to a single base, vectors are quite important because physically that base station in the coordinate doesn't exist. So just in order to recreate, vectors become quite important.
So I'm cheating. I'm throwing up a slide for a pre-prepared answer. I think it's the right one. What Linz would like to see, base to rover vectors preferred. I don't think a course base makes any difference. I've done some maths on this, and even if you've got a 30-kilometre baseline from the nearest cause base to where your rover is, if you show the vector to 0.1 of a second, it's about 5 mil in the coordinate in terms of the rounding error. So the important thing is when you're measuring vectors that long, you've got to have a heap of epochs measured to that if you're doing RTK. If you do the maths on the stats and the accuracy, and you're doing a rover-to-rover vector at that range, you probably need to be measuring in excess of 120 epochs to get that sort of accuracy. Bruce and Mel might be able to correct me on that. So the important thing is if you are going to use a cause base, make sure your vectors are accurate and then round them to 0.1 of a second.
Anybody else want to comment on? We've probably heard from this, I guess heard a little bit from this from Tony on this, but I'll ask the question anyway. GNSS methodology is important. Should we be recording this at the time of survey? So what Tony was suggesting was having a standard methodology and following that in the field and recording this in the survey report. Any other comments that anyone wants to make about that?
Yeah, we just have a general comment on that standard methodology that we use every time that goes into the survey report. And what the field book does then is back up that methodology, because you've got the columns that show your epochs and your length of observation and time difference for your independent measurements as well. So combination.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to comment on this. I think it's important is that you not only record epochs, but you record the length of time, because you can take 20 epochs in a second. That's not 20 seconds of occupation, right? So I think you need to consider how you are recording that.
Yeah, good point, Bruce. I should have mentioned that. Yeah, our epochs were always 1 second hertz. So if you were 10 epochs, it was 10 seconds. But if you've seen some of Bruce's earlier presentations in terms of accuracy of RTK measurement, I think the optimal time is 1 to 2 minutes, isn't it, Bruce, in terms of getting really good accuracy. So it's more about the time span of your occupation rather than, as Bruce says, the number of epochs.
Okay, so we've touched on this again also. What is the place of the handwritten field book? Is there a benefit of using one in combination with electronic recording? I guess we had this a little bit from Bruce and Mel, but perhaps Tony's probably, from those pictures, probably positive, but
I think whatever's easier for you to do in the field. What we don't want to see is your field work process becoming a burden now that you're trying to submit stuff to Linz. So whatever's simple and easiest for you, whether it's a separate handwritten note. If I was out in the field now, I'd probably start to use one of these with a stylus, or get myself a data recorder that enables me to do this on the data recorder. You want it fine enough that what you don't want is use your finger, because you get a big fat wobbly line. But what you want as the end result is when you've hit print, when you do your report, it wants to be able to be immediately interpreted.
Yeah, I'd just say again on the efficiency front, I did buy a field book in October when I started up, and I don't think I've used it once. But the data recorder can do all sorts with it. Take photos, draw diagrams, so draw occupation offsets, and that way, yeah, again about efficiency and a good record. It comes through in that field book, and so it's all there at the end.
I'd just like to add, I think it's worth considering is the split between your cadastral and topographical information, and that if you're doing these massively combined jobs, there's ways and means that we only get out the cadastral information. So if you consider that, then your field book report should be relatively complete and relatively small if you can, remove your topographical type information.
Thanks. With human error removed from the recording process, how does this affect the options for recording and the options for measuring an independent check?
What I say is do what you always do. Do what you've always done. And there's ways and means we can handle that electronically. You just really need to talk to your supplier about how you're doing it. It's not about changing your workflow. This is not the whole of this conversation. It's not about changing workflows. Okay, so if you independently set up resection, well, actually, I love resections. I think resection should be used more often. That can all be handled in your recorder. You can traverse through it. You can do included angles or zero sets. It's all, all that stuff is recorded and it's reportable.
So I think when you're using the new technology in the field doesn't replace what we call good survey practice. So it's being aware of what your technology can and can't do, and then of course completing enough independent checks in the field so that you're meeting the rules and regulations.
I saw an example once of someone had taken several shots as they were walking down the road. When he downloaded it into the office, all the points were in the same position in someone's house because their auto lock had locked onto a mirror. So yeah, single measurement, no booking error, fine, but was it the point you measured to? So independent checks, I believe, are important. Changing face is a good way of trying to eliminate the auto lock problem. Double ties is obviously a tried and true method. I think they use that in South Africa quite a lot. Just as we mentioned before, a system that means that at the end of your setup, you're confident that you've measured to that point twice. Set it out, you put your little hole in the ground. I don't believe that's when you should hit the stakeout button. I believe you should be doing that after the peg's in the ground, on top of the peg afterwards. And I used to always then do a separate left and right face on top of the stakeout point.
Okay. In 2021, what is a field note and how does this differ from an office note?
So in 2021, that's this year, I don't think it's any different to what people have been doing 10, 20 years ago. I think the question we should be asking is, what do we want a field note to look like at the end of 2021 and in 10 years' time from now, etc. And so I think it, based on my knowledge of the technology and what it's capable of, it's possible that we could be thinking about in the future, especially with the updates to Land Online, that we could be submitting a digital file to LINZ that's run through a style sheet in a format that LINZ have potentially specified that's reusable. And then, of course, you could have your supplementary information in addition to that. And sort of to add to that, I think it's entirely possible too with the technology, especially on Windows 10 controllers, that in the future, just streaming, that one day surveyors could be streaming live data from LINZ. They could be completing their field survey in the field in a live environment, completing all of their calculations, everything in the field, and then submitting their CSD to LINZ from the field off that controller. So I think, today, I don't think there's any change. It could be a photocopy of the back of your arm. But then in the future, there is a lot of potential for field notes based on where the technology is today and where I believe it will be in the future.
Someone asked me the question at morning tea. Trying to think what the question was now. But when does a field note with the raw data, the real raw data that's measured in the field and what's presented to LINZ, where does the difference discriminate. And to try and explain that, you've got a set of measured GPS data, and its raw form, it's a Cartesian system, isn't it, Bruce, in WGS 84, which is meaningless to most of us. We can't really interpret that. But the way I see it is, if you're just translating that, like in the good old days of maths at school, we had Cartesian coordinates, and then we translate that to polar coordinates. Effectively, all you're doing is translating that set of measured data, and I call it the metadata, because the data recorders record bucket loads of stuff in the background. You're translating that into the system that you're working in that LINS wants to see, which is essentially geodetic datum 2000 on the projection you're working on with ellipsoidal distances. So you're translating it. It's really just a reduction. It's no different than reducing a slope distance to a horizontal distance and then bringing that down to sea level. So there is some office notes, if you like, in the process of taking your raw data to reduce data. But in my mind, that's still field information, because you haven't tinkered with it. You haven't put it into a Bowditch adjustment or a least squares adjustment and adjusted it. It's still the measurements that you made. So I think there's always going to be a little bit of blurring and tidying up back in the office. We used to do that with manual notes anyway. You'd come back and sharpen your pencil and add a bit more information while it was still in your head, and you put it on the page. It wasn't necessarily recorded in the field. But what you don't want is then to be adding stuff that is imaginary or made up.
Anybody else want to add anything? Move on. Okay. Perhaps at this stage, I'll just ask again, are there any, we want this to try and be interactive. Got a load of questions come through on the Slido. They're more talkative, these guys. But are there any questions in the room anyone would like to ask? And I'll run the microphone down to you.
Yeah, slightly related, obviously, but I'm just, obviously there's been an acknowledgement that the field record has to be clear and readable, which I support, obviously. We use old survey plans, pretty much a day-to-day part of our resource. Some of those pre-300 plans are pretty hard to read as they've been imaged. In respect of the field notes needing to be clear, I just wonder, it's a bit of an open-ended question, but whether there's a desire from LINS or perhaps a potential project for LINS to re-image those pre-300 series plans so that they are readable. I know that there's a process to do it as a one-off, and that's really great, and it works, it shows you how brilliant those old plans can be. The sort of secondary question to that is, be useful if they would be free, because they're a key part of the record as field notes. Anybody likely to respond to that?
Just let me run the microphone back. Is that you, Tony? Are you game for that one?
I probably can't answer that. I'll get myself into serious trouble. Yeah, there is a process, and you've mentioned it. So at the moment, if someone requests a manual product, what our team do is they don't just scan that and then send the plan back and put it in the box. They actually then add that to the record. The problem is it's not part of that set that was originally distributed that was for free. So I'm not sure whether there's a provision for the providers of those products to then request new images from LINS. At the moment, it's probably budgetary driven. At the moment, we're doing some of the South Island field books, for example, and we probably don't have enough money at the moment to do all of them, but when funds come available, we do hit projects like this. But re-imaging all the imperial plans in colour is probably going to be a massive project, so I wouldn't expect to see that happen soon, but keep putting pressure on through your professional body.
Any more questions from the floor?
So we're using Trimble gear. So with the New Zealand field book reports, is there ways you could also introduce the photos and things like that into those, or are Trimble looking at doing something like that to help us get the information to LINS?
I didn't quite hear. So you're using the New Zealand field book report?
I've been putting those in every now and then, but like adding photos and things like that, can we do that, or can you
Yep. So we can definitely make changes to that field book report. So that one's publicly available on the Trimble download site, but we have a team that can help develop or edit those style sheets, and we can also go directly to Trimble to edit that original one on the website as well.
So is that happening, or do we need to?
Well, I've already gathered some feedback from customers using that, and we are looking into making those amendments. But if anyone using Trimble and is using those, then they can come to me, and I'm happy to work with you to get those changes. And it's probably likewise with Bruce for Leica customers. They can contact Bruce, and he can work with them to get the right style sheets made and things.
Just very quickly, if you're not a Leica or a Trimble user and you're using a poor man's GPS, you can you can do simple things like this. Just paste your images up onto an A4 sheet of paper. You probably get 8 or 10 images on a sheet of paper. Export it as a PDF and attach it as a supporting field note. As simple as that. Keep the size down. You don't need 1200 DPI on these things. 150 DPI will be sufficient to illustrate what you're talking about.
Was there a question at the back as well?
Thanks. Yeah, beyond what's been kind of announced this morning with the widening of formats and that kind of stuff of what's being accepted, and it's kind of been alluded to by both Bruce and Mel, be it that a lot of the data that we're capturing today is kind of very attribute heavy, going to PDF and TIFF formats, you're actually dumbing it down to fit in the system. 10 years time, that information is going to be really useful. Is there any plans or intentions to look into expanding formats to capture some of this info going forward?
Is that question being asked of me? I've been told to say yes. Look, steps under development. The Institute has a professional rep on that development team. So again, if you think you've got a good idea, then let your profession and your representative know, and also your Cadastral Commission know. We've got representatives that communicate regularly with LINZ. I guess the problem is how much is enough. And at the moment, we're just talking about enough to get your data set approved and protect the integrity of the cadaster. So that's really the benchmark starting point. If you can come up with systems that have bells and whistles on top of that, by all means, if LINZ can accept it, but we might have to look at the protocols. At the moment, TIFFs and PDFs are the way to get it in there.
Any more on the floor, or shall we? I can look at some of the Slido ones, might answer some of those if there's no more in the room at the moment. We've got one here. Would we be able to present isometric and or three-dimensional drawings if trying to define a complex data boundary? Can we use different colors or hatching to define different areas?
I can't do that at the moment as a supporting plan graphic. Supporting plan graphic type doesn't support colored PDFs at this point in time. So I'm not quite sure where that would sit, but the Surveyor General is keen to pursue a 3D cadaster. So again, I think that will probably reveal itself more with the step development. But certainly as supporting diagrams, if you can get them into LINZ and you can report on them and refer to them, then that may help.
When LINZ has requested old field notes from surveyors in the past to resolve issues, what was the important information in these field notes? This may dictate what is important going forward.
Tough questions.
They're all at you, Tony.
Yeah, from my own experience, height of the base station, height of the total station, I've really thrashed that one today. Look, if any of you guys send an ellipsoidal distance that's not corrected to sea level after today, I don't know what to do. Yeah, sorry, what was the question again?
What was the important information in the field notes?
Yeah, it's really the measured vector to the mark that we're finding we're having a problem with. What step will do, it will give you the same least squares stuff that we've got internally at the moment. that can identify or highlight. It might not identify the particular mark, it might identify a cluster of vectors, and in our system they're called very bads. And so what we're doing is we're then trying to say, well, is any of this stuff measured that the surveyor measured, and in other words, not adopted? And it will highlight, hey, this surveyor, he's going between two fifth order marks and he's got a 0.2 misclose and he's used GPS. It shouldn't be 0.2 out. So we want to see that measurement. So having the information there on hand enables us to do that. If we interrogate the surveyor and say, just give us that one vector, it might not be the answer. The answer might be an adoption over here that's thrown it out. And in one case I had where he'd captured a boundary and he'd forgotten to take off a road widening bit because it was a park cancel title. Now that one adopted boundary was skewing all the other vectors in that data set. So until we actually know that the measurements are good, then we start trying to identify where the error is. So the short answer is, if we've got all the information, then if we start trying to look at little subsets of information, where do you start and where do you stop? It's better to have a lot.
I just think I'm going to support Tony here, which might be a bit of a surprise. But what I tend to think is that someone's got to be able to recreate that survey. So that's what's important. You might have to recreate one of your employee surveys, right? So it's to me, what goes in the field note should be, you should feel confident that I can recreate the survey. And if it's not there, well, then you can't recreate it.
Good answer, Bruce. Wish I'd said it myself.
Right, I'm going to skip down one because there's a question for Mel, not Tony. Is field data still considered raw after we undertake a network adjustment in TBC, post cleanup of coding, etc.? Is a network adjustment report a suitable record of our field notes?
It's not field data because it's been adjusted. I think that is probably the right way to answer that. But if you did do that adjustment, that report can be generated and put into Land Online. But yeah, I'm not quite sure if I answered that well enough. But yeah, just to go back, if you've adjusted it, it's not the raw field data.
Yeah, the dirty word there is adjust. So yeah, submit it as a calc sheet by all means, but think about how you can submit the raw data or the reduced data before it was adjusted.
One more here. Provision of field data should not be raster, as vector could be used digitally. Have LINs allowed for vectorized PDFs?
I think we have, haven't we, Lyndon? For the field information report and the water boundary report at this time. Yep, and I haven't had Lyndon's got the videos. He hasn't. I don't think he's got a hands-on yet, so I haven't been able to test it. So I can't comment further on that. But my impression is that you should be able to suck out of that cut and paste information that's in that.
Okay. Any more questions in the room? I've got a few more pre-prepared questions. This might be an obvious one, but. Comments: should another surveyor be able to prepare the data set from your field notes? There's a lot of nodding going on.
The 1959 regulations told us to, so what's different?
I think we'll say yes.
Yeah, so yes, unanimous.
Right, unanimous. Okay, we've seen a little bit of this today, so I guess perhaps this is interesting. Many surveyors are now taking photographs as part of the survey. Everyone's doing it. Is there a place for these in the official record? Should we be?
Yes. Yeah, like I think Mel said earlier, yeah, picture speaks 1,000 words. So.
Yeah, I don't think it all just has to be a photograph. It can be a sketch. You know, it could be a screen capture of your data. Even with some of your topographical information on that screen, that helps identify where that water boundary. Definitely, it's 100%.
I guess that's where you probably have an information privacy policy as part of your practice. I certainly set one up for drone photography, and you're quite right. You do have to be careful of what you're presenting. I think some of those images there, I don't think there's any critical private information. So yeah, we're fine. Yeah, official record. I think if you lodge it as a supporting field note, which is good, then it will become part of the official record, and someone else can look at it and interpret from that information what they need to. I was just thinking, would we pull out an old peg that we dug out and put in a courier bag and send it to Lynn's as evidence that we found the old mark? No. On that earlier survey we saw at the beginning of this morning, I found an 1870s odd peg, and it was perfectly lying on its side, and the tip of the peg was in the right position. It had just fallen over and the ground had worn away, but it wasn't enough to confirm the peg was in the right place. But the job was for the client, and the client bagged that when it went up into his hut in the bush block that I was doing the job for. I wished I could have kept it myself. But yeah, the point of that is that, yes, it's useful historical record, but it's not essential. These images are not essential, but if they support your definition, then by all means submit them.
Right, we're starting to get a bit down the list now, but well, I think we've had the one about the recording old marks not found in the search location. So I think we've heard about people coding, using a code of old mark not found for marks that you're not finding, so that it's clear in your electronic data that it's not affixed to an old mark. I don't know if you guys want to comment on this. How do you record main traverse bearings as a set? So the technology type one.
Yeah, I can sort of answer that maybe. So you know, that's a damn good question, and I've sort of thought about this a little bit when I've been building these style sheets. I suppose the answer is, well, okay, so the reason we go to HTML, we create an HTML report. And the fundamental reason why we create an HTML report is because it's manipulable. I'm not saying it's editable, it's manipulatable. So in other words, you can resort it and reorder it. Okay, so you could do it by point name, so then all your observations are in the order point name, or you could do it by time, and this is why it becomes part of the QA process, because you can then look at what your field staff has done and sort of either by the time they've done it, so you can see if they've done right, left, or you could do it by point name, right, left. So there are ways and means which you can do it, and I think you just really, do you want it? Do you want to see it that way? Well, you just sort an HTML document. That's how we do it.
This might be getting pretty nerdy, but it gets into how, like, the way I understand that question is potentially might be different to Bruce, but gets into sort of like how the software ends up calculating things. And so from the wearing my Trimble hat, we have like there's a function called like, what is it, like sets, and it does the mean turned angles. And so, yeah, it measures you set your back sight and you go around and do your rounds. And all the mean angles are recorded as well as the residuals, etc. And then from there, if you need to adjust it and apply the true forward azimuth, you just then apply those angles differences. But all of the information, again, is recorded in the software, including all of the residuals to those points measured.
What Mel's talking about, sorry. Set collection mode in a Trimble data recorder. These 2 points are collected by set collection. So there's set to that mark, and then it gives you the means at the bottom of the 2 sets. So it'll depend very entirely on your third-party provider. What I suggest, if you're wanting to capture bearings as set collections, go out and practice first. Make sure you get the process right. And then put it into practice and teach your field teams how to do that. It's really just a matter of the power in these data recorders now is so good. It's just a matter of knowing what they can do and then applying it.
Okay, well, we're pretty much at the end of our pre-prepared questions. We're at the end of our Slido questions. Are we at the end of our in the room questions? Any last questions?
I can answer that question. You get on your horse and you ride back to the office.
Yeah, nothing else is coming through. And
One more slide.
you got one more slide. Tony's always got more information to share.
It's all right. Reece Gardner isn't here, is he? And the reason why I'm raising this is I can find it. Is this yeah, there we go. That's the slide I want.
The new rules are going to require you to show a measured vector to all new and old boundary marks. You can't show a calculated vector to these marks. It has to be a measured vector. That's what the new rules say. Now, we've had this old debate, and if you look at the lodgement standard, section 4.2, and I had this discussion many years ago with Don Grant when I first started using my system 500, and Lynn's guidance at the time was you move the base and you do a whole heap of second occupations and you record all your double ties. And the plans were getting so cluttered very quickly. Can't we just show derived GPS vectors? So in the end, Don agreed that a derived rover-to-rover vector can be considered as measured. You're supporting it with your field notes with the two base-to-rover vectors. Someone can run out the two missing lines and reproduce it. So the debate is, are derived vectors measured or calculated? Now, I like this illustration because it shows, if I was to ask you, how do you measure the diameter of that steel rod, and you don't have access to both ends to run the ruler across both ends, how do you measure the diameter of that rod? And quite literally, you use a pair of calipers. You use a measuring device that's designed to measure that distance. And GPS is no different. There's your base station, put your rover there, you put your rover there, and you get your derived vector. So I would use section 4.2 of the lodgement standard to satisfy Lynn's requirement to show GPS measured vectors to your new and old boundary marks. Now, you may disagree with me. I know Reece does. We're on opposite poles on this. You may have your own thoughts. But yeah, that's how you can show measured vectors using GPS rover to rover.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, look, I totally agree with Tony, but thinking in practicalities of a style sheet to do that, the problem is if you wanted those calculated ones, you've got to produce every combination to get the combination you want. So, 100 lines is about 5,050 recordings you need to calculate on a style sheet. That then you have to then remove the ones you can't remove it because you field note. So you can't remove it. So while it's a good idea, it's not practical in the production of a field note.
Yeah, so this is why Lynn's prefers to see the base to rover vectors as your field information. And then in your summary or your reduction of the information, you might do a summary report that shows the rover to rovers that are captured into your data set. And it's easy to do. We've all been doing it now, whether you do it by coordinate basis or by vector comparison. But yeah, that's the secret.
Okay, we've got another question come through on the Slido, so I'll just read this one out quickly. How do you delete the extra topo data from an HTML?
Give me a call. But it's, it's not rocket science, but just give us a call.
Well, if there are no more questions, are there any last comments anyone wants to make, or are you commented out? Okay, in that case, it's my pleasure on behalf of Survey and Spatial New Zealand Cadastral Stream to thank our four presenters, Tony, Mel, Bruce and Erin and their employers, Lynn's, Trimble Global Survey and Envelope Surveying. There's quite a lot of work that goes into preparing presentations of this standard, so I'm really grateful for the efforts of our presenters, for their time and expertise and for the huge that I know they've put into this beforehand. I'm sure that everyone here and those watching online will agree that they've done a great job. Personally, I felt that I gained something from all of the presentations. So would you please join me now and thank our four presenters in the usual way. So also, if you'll bear with me, I have a couple of other people to thank today. Firstly, Jenny Hoodalakis from National Office. Jenny, please stand up. Jenny's done a great deal of behind the scenes to ensure that today is successful, so thank you very much, Jenny. Also, a couple of local branch members who've assisted, Dave Robinson of Oricon, Chair of the Canterbury branch, for help with promotion of today's event. And Rita Clark of Mile & Co, who is your Canterbury representative on the Cadastral Stream Leadership Group. Thank you, Rita, for your help as well. So, thank you. Also, thank you for bearing with us. We got a little bit crowded today. We had a few extra people that we didn't really know about until today turn up. So we've pretty well filled up the room. So thank you very much for your forbearance with that. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone here for coming along, and for those watching online. Providing events like this comes at quite a cost, which cannot be justified if members don't participate. So thank you all for supporting this event. And also, before we go, just a quick reminder that the Survey and Spatial New Zealand National Conference is in Auckland at the Cadastral Hotel on the 4th and 5th of August. As usual, there'll be an excellent technical program, including more on the new cadastral survey rules. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.